Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to the first session after lunch, which I feel like is always a tough sell because everyone is a little bit tired and a little bit sleepy, and it's a little bit cold today. So I'm so grateful to everybody for coming here to listen to all of the cool ideas that I'm excited to hear from my fellow presenters today. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Lucy Roberts, and today I'm going to be presenting talk which I'm calling Environmental Disaster Mapping, the Cartographies of Climate Change and Hazardous Waste, and an emphasis on this is an exploratory comparative analysis. So this is a lot of thoughts that I've been processing over the last summer, and I really invite anybody who wants to talk with me more about them after this presentation to please come up and do so, because this is really starting to shape what is developing into a larger research project for me, and I would really love any input that people have on these ideas. With that said, I'm going to be generally going over these three things. First off, looking at why we should care about comparing these two different types of cartographies, as well as what we know and what, at least I think, we need to know about the similarities and differences between hazardous waste mapping and climate change. But selfishly, I'm going to start with why I care about talking about these two issues. And this gets a little beyond the cartographies of it, but it's something that I find interesting, and this is my personal soapbox. So this is a cool thing for me. I first started thinking about this because as a graduate student, I have a couple of different jobs, and one of those is I'm working with a law professor at the University of Oregon, Michael Moffitt. And we were researching this act, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Cleanup, and Liability Act, also known as CERCLA, which was passed in 1980. And CERCLA is a really interesting piece of legislation that we use to manage hazardous waste in the United States. So under CERCLA, a site of pollution is identified and added to the national priority list if it meets a certain threshold for toxicity. At that point, the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, establishes a cleanup plan to manage that hazardous waste. But when they establish the cleanup plan, they start identifying these people that they refer to as potentially responsible parties. And these potentially responsible parties can take a number of different forms. So if we're talking about a former landfill, for example, it could be the person who is operating the landfill business. It could be the person who owned the land that the landfill was operating on, or it could be the person who owned the land 30 years ago and sold it to the person who rented it out to become a landfill. So there's a host of these potentially responsible parties. And while they're identifying those and starting the cleanup process, the EPA funds this cleanup using money in a public trust, which is known as the Superfund Trust. And that is why we all call a lot of these big toxic waste sites Superfund sites. It's not until after the cleanup is already in way and undergone that the EPA then demands the cost be recovered from these potentially responsible parties. And that can be really, really expensive, especially because liability, and so who has to pay for it, is strict, joint and several, and retroactive. And I'm a cartographer who had to learn all of this for the job I was working on, so let me just give you the cliff notes of it. But it's liable even if you didn't intend to cause harm. Even if you thought you were following the best practices of the time, you can still be held liable. It's joint and several, which means that each individual is liable for up to the entire sum of the cost of recovery. So if up to 15 people are responsible, one of them can be held responsible for the entire sum of the recovery. And it's retroactive. So parties can be held liable for actions taken even before CERCLA was passed in 1980. Meaning that if one of those potentially responsible parties was a landlord who held a landfill site from 1970 to 1975, they could still be held liable under this act. And that is important, because this is a really cool way that we can hold people who are polluting our environment responsible for the actions that they are committing. And so I was taking the seminar on climate change attribution studies at the end of last year, and I was really thinking, why aren't we talking more about this hazardous waste act? Why isn't this being applied to the question of climate change? And I got really lucky when my final paper came around, because all of a sudden, at the exact same time I was taking the class, two states, Vermont and New York, became the first states to actually pass an adaptation of CERCLA in order to hold fossil fuel companies liable for climate change. And this really started to get me thinking about why it is that there are similarities and differences between hazardous waste and climate change. If it should be appropriate for us to be able to apply this kind of act to climate change, maybe there are lessons that we can learn from our past in mapping hazardous waste that we could then apply to the research of climate change. As of right now, 5 states have introduced legislation to adapt CERCLA to apply it to climate change. 3 of them probably aren't going to pass it, but the 2 that are currently facing a slew of lawsuits. And so in those lawsuits, they're directly citing climate attribution studies from the field of geography to be able to account for the reason why they are connecting fossil fuel companies to climate change. And that made me feel really important, because I was like, okay, well, we're geographers, and if cartography is the language of geography, how can we use it more effectively to advocate for responsibility and these polluter pays types laws? So I wanted to just briefly go over kind of an overview of what we know and what we don't yet know about hazardous waste and climate change mapping. And I will say that there are several people in this room who work on this and who I'm talking about right now, so I'm sorry for oversimplifying a lot of your work. But this is going to be a broad overview of these 2 fields. So first off, for mapping hazardous waste, there's a robust and huge literature from outside the field of cartography that focus on the act of mapping climate change. So critiquing and problematizing the idea of mapping risk. What does it mean to ascribe labels to risk and to call certain communities and geographies riskier than others? And what does the role of mapping play in hazardous waste management? How can map makers allow for us to mitigate these issues more? And then within the cartographic literature, hazardous waste is often kind of used as a theme for a lot of different types of user studies. So there's like Ian Muhlenhaus's If Looks Could Kill, the impact of different rhetorical styles on persuasive geocommunication, where Muhlenhaus adapts the several different maps to show different ranges of nuclear fallout. And Vincent et al. Looking at improving spatial decision-making using interactive maps from the UW-Madison CART Lab. Hi, Rob. Where they were using an empirical study looking at North American hazardous waste trade. And I thought this was really interesting because in a lot of ways, we often use hazardous waste as kind of a proxy to be able to look at when we're trying to determine what variables we need to modify to improve our cartographic rhetoric. And so what is it that we intuitively understand about hazardous waste, and how can we try and make that more easily accessible for maps of climate change? And then I wanted to also note here that Mark Monmonier in 1997 published the Cartographies of Danger, Mapping Hazards in America. This book is largely focused on an outside audience external to cartography, talking about how can we apply just core tenets of cartography to these external fields. And then in the question of mapping climate change, there's a lot of recent research that's been pushed forward, especially by my advisor, Carolyn Fish, about rhetoric and technique and how can we use persuasive mapping to impact climate change. And so my question is, how can we compare the maps that we're currently making of climate change, and how can we ask the right questions of each of those 2 different styles of maps? And how can we learn from the successes and failures of other styles of mapping as we approach these new different types of environmental dangers? And I think this is interesting because there's a lot of conceptual similarities between hazardous waste pollution and climate change. Both are driven by anthropogenic environmental adaptation and disproportionately impact low-income and marginalized communities, which mean that oftentimes maps focus on similar stories, but they tell them in oftentimes different ways. And this is oftentimes attributable to industrial and commercial interests, which is where we get our host of potentially responsible parties. And in the field of geography, we're increasingly developing newer and newer research that's able to actually link the proportion of climate change that's attributable to different fossil fuel emitters and to different environmental actors. And so when we have things like these polluter pays laws, how can we make it explicit on the maps that we are making who is doing the polluting so that we can name them when it becomes time for us to approach them in court to have, or to just have a more explicit understanding of how those dynamics are playing out. And in my informal conversations so far, there have been two kind of core conceptual differences that keep emerging in my conversations. The first is the idea that hazardous waste is easily associated between the polluter and the pollution, and that because there is a specific, distinct site of pollution, that means that it's easy to identify who the polluter is. But this is a complete misconception of hazardous waste. First off, as I explained earlier, there are many different potentially responsible parties who can be held liable when there is a large site of hazardous waste. And additionally, if you look at places like different Superfund sites, there will oftentimes be multiple different areas or different industries that are contributing to the same site. These don't have a single precise location, and yet on their maps of hazardous waste, we tend to be able to simplify and generalize it down to a singular point to allow for a clearer comparison. Conversely, with climate change, there are causal links that are obscured through convoluted chains, and therefore we tend to show in our maps of climate change things like forest deforestation or CO2 emissions, but not link those back to point sources. And I think this is a point that we can improve on, or that I'm trying to understand why we don't make that connection as often in our maps of climate change. The second question is about spatial spread. And again, here we have this idea that hazardous waste is somehow confined to a particular area or a particular region, often in minoritized or low-income areas. But that's not always the case either. If you consider the case of Chernobyl in Russia, there's a large swath reaching down from Chernobyl that is impacted and has higher rates of thyroid cancer because of long-term radioactive fallout. And it's this spatial spread of waste that doesn't get depicted in maps of hazardous waste, where I think that maybe our innovations and understanding of climate change cartography could potentially help us to build stronger maps of hazardous waste. So with that said, I'm starting to develop these set of research questions, asking how are maps of hazardous waste and climate change in the news media and government communications compare in their use of mapping genres and mapping styles? And if possible, given time limitations, when looking at potentially doing a user study, asking when users look at a map of hazardous waste versus climate change, what is it that they're taking away from the image? If I just show a map of hazardous waste, or I show what is supposed to be a map of climate change, is that labeling and identifying the polluter that's causing those types of environmental changes? Or does it feel like a naturalized process? Is it something that feels like it's becoming naturalized against the landscape and it isn't something within our personal control? To me, this is all about agency. If we can identify the polluter, then we can identify the cause of the issue. And when we have these things like polluter pays laws in the United States, we can start to make a difference on the core root of the problem. Some differences that I've started to notice in my kind of exploratory phase are differences in temporality. And this comes from my background. My previous research was heavily focused in COVID-19 dashboards. And I was reading a lot about how in the United States, these COVID-19 communication was focused on future projections of disease spread. And this was very different from other international organizations who weren't continuing to project into the future. When I look at these maps of climate change, they often have a wide spread of temporality, looking at differences over time from the historic amount of carbon emissions to now, and then projecting into the future what could happen in the future. And the issue with this can be that if we don't hit those targets, or if something changes, or if carbon emissions go down, it decreases the legitimacy of the map as it stood in that point in time. Versus hazardous waste, maps of hazardous waste tend to be very temporally situated, looking at the here and now. And when they aren't, when they do address temporality, it tends to be sites that have previously been cleaned up and are now not being addressed or remediated by the EPA. And so this kind of question of temporality gets really distilled down into like the singular moment that the user is looking at the map. The lack of visibility of the polluter also has become a recurring theme, and something that I'm really curious about how that impacts the user's experience of the map itself. And then finally, with climate change, there often is a level of expertise, or there are many more like dashboards and interactive elements in these maps of climate change. And this requires a level of expertise from the part of the user to be able to interact with it, to understand, to interpret it. And it also means that it can be taken out of context and placed into different mediums and misinterpreted and contribute to disinformation. And so it's really about distilling down what are the core messages behind these dashboards, what is the spatial story that we are trying to communicate, and how can we lend more credibility to the idea that there are distinct, nameable people who are able to attribute this pollution to, and we can start to make concrete steps in addressing these large-scale environmental issues. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And if you could please talk to me afterwards, I would love to hear any feedback or ideas that you have on this talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We have time for a couple questions. Anyone? I'm going to close this door while you think of a question.
I thought you were like walking to someone who had a question, and I was like,
yeah. Anybody have any questions? All right.
You got one over there.
Oh, great. Okay.
Have you looked, when looking at pollution sources, have you considered non-point pollution?
For climate change or for hazardous waste, or? I think that's the interesting thing, and there is a lot of different types of pollution that obviously contribute to hazardous waste. When we're talking about these like really concrete or like Superfund sites, or like the sites that tend to get mapped, they tend to get mapped as point sources. And I think that's the question that I'm really interested in, is not like, I agree that I would say plenty of hazardous waste sources don't actually come from a point, but I'm interested in why we continue to represent them as points, and how applicable is that to other types of environmental degradation.
Yes?
I have a question about the map users.
Mm-hmm.
I guess maybe more history of the environmental waste kind of hazardous mapping. Are there different groups that say, those two groups that you're looking at, kind of different focus on the actual users of the map?
Yes, so to repeat your question, I think you're asking about, are there different users for each of these different types of maps that we're looking at? And yeah, I think that is a really important point. I think one thing that I've noticed in these maps of hazardous waste, a lot of them tend to be much more, the public-facing ones tend to be much more limited versus, I'm guessing if I happen to have like EPA certification, I would be able to have access to a lot more broader swath of maps of hazardous waste. But I think that in of itself is very interesting, because it speaks to what do we want to communicate to the public, and what is it that the public's getting. And I feel like sometimes with climate change communication, we're kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, and trying to make sure that everyone has as much information as possible. And my question is, at what point are we not distilling the information to, in kind of a manageable and digestible way?
Thank you. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you.
All right.